The Sabbath is not a moral law. Morality is not a festival. The Sabbath was a festival. Morality is not a festival to be kept, nor does morality hinge on a specific block of time. In other words, it's right to do the right thing all the time. It's right to do the right thing all the time. And doing the wrong thing is wrong all the time. And so morality is not hinged on a specific block or section of time in the week. For the Adventists, it's like, okay, this is moral. Let's use the same argument that they use for the Sabbath for not murder. So for 6 days, you are free to murder. But on the seventh day, you should stop murdering. This is basically what the Sabbath is. Now, can this hold true? It can't. Because the fact of the matter is morality is not hinged on time, beloved friends. That which is right to do all the time. And that which is wrong to do all the time. But the Sabbath, you're only to keep it on one small section of time. After that, you do all that you couldn't do on it. Then when it comes again, you have to stop doing certain things. That is not moral.
5 reasons the fourth commandment is moral. 5 reasons why it is a moral issue. I'm not going to repeat or detail the fourth commandment itself. I'm assuming you know what it says. But as we go through each section, you're going to see that each section of the fourth commandment is itself a moral issue. And let me just say that I think the error that the critic committed here is in viewing the moral portion, the moral aspect, with the Sabbath and not with the fourth commandment. There's a difference because the Sabbath is once a week, but the fourth commandment is not once a week. The fourth commandment is an everyday commandment that tells you about something to take place on 6 days and something to take place on the seventh of those 7 days. That makes sense? And that's, I think, the problem of the critic. And so let's begin by looking at each section here. The first section is that the fourth commandment commands work. Now, the question for us is this a moral issue? Right? Well, there's many verses you'll see there. I'll just break down some details here. Work is a moral requirement commanded all the way from the Garden of Eden. From the very beginning, you find that God gave Adam and Eve work to do. According to Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, he was commanded to work the garden, right? And to protect the garden. And so from then on, even after sin, work was still a requirement and a moral necessary. We know from health perspectives that if you don't work, right, if you're not active, if your mind is not active and your body's not active, I worked in the medical field for about 15 years. I know, and many of you likely know, that that would cause issues with your body, which in fact was bought with a price. Amen. It was bought with a price on the cross. And so work is a moral issue. The Bible tells us in 3 John 2, brethren, I pray above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health. Right? So we have the Bible telling us to be in health and to work. In these particular verses you see here, such as 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy 5:8, Paul talking about how work is necessary, condemning laziness and saying that if you don't work, you don't eat, basically. In fact, in one of those verses, he says that he who doesn't work and provide for a family is worse than an infidel. And then you have a couple of verses in Proverbs. There's many in Proverbs, actually. I just put 2 there. Talks about the moral detriment of not working. And so we have the element of work in the fourth commandment being a moral issue. Let's look at the next part. Another element of the fourth commandment is rest. Restlessness is damaging, and we are to be in health. We spoke about that already with 3 John 2. And so when you don't rest, you hurt your body. The Bible tells us the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And by extension, if you don't cause others to rest, like the fourth commandment tells you to, that is a moral issue towards others as well. Does that make sense? Same thing with work. If you don't allow others to work in some fashion, that is a moral issue too, because of the implications on your health and on the health of other people. And so restfulness is definitely a moral issue. In fact, at one point when Jesus was doing ministry with the disciples, he tells them, come now by the side and rest a while. And they were doing ministry work. So it's such a moral issue that even when you're doing ministry, God still says you still gotta rest, right? So it is a moral duty not to overwork ourselves, our employees, our family, even our cattle, according to the fourth commandment, our animals. It's that important that God even included them. And so another good text is Romans chapter 12, verses 1-2, where incidentally, Paul, as he's writing to the Romans here, he mixes two very important things. I'm going to read that text to you. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. It says, I beseech you, brethren, therefore, uh, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, I was thinking of another verse, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable, which is your reasonable service. So notice how he mentions your body. But then he says in the next verse, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So you see, Paul's concern is not just the mind, which is the emphasis typically placed upon in among Christians. It's the body with the mind. And so we have moral, we have work, and we have rest being a moral issue. Does that make sense? Give me a one or a yes in the comment section if that makes sense, and if you're following along. Notice the next part. It commands God's day. God's day. Now, this is where a lot of people have an issue. They say, well, it's not, this particular seventh day is not important because it could be on any day, right? There's nothing inherently moral about the seventh day. I disagree with that, and I'm going to explain a couple of reasons why. First of all, Exodus chapter 20, verse 9. Well, from verse 8, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Then verse 9 says, 6 days you shall labor, but the seventh day. Why is it a moral issue for it to be on the seventh day? Because God said so. He's the boss. And he said, seventh day. If you do it your way versus God's way, that's a moral issue. Let me give you a really good example of this. This verse does not talk about the seventh day, but it serves as a good example. In fact, Jason, you think you can go to this verse? You know how sometimes you go to the texts? Go to that one here, and let's take a look at this one.
Sorry, it was, I forget the verse. It was which one?
Deuteronomy
Verse
chapter
19?
12.
Deuteronomy 12. Let's
Mhm.
go. Verse. Which verse?
We're
I
going
missed
to
it.
go to verse 29.
29. You want NKG, New King James or King James?
Oh boy, that's the age-old debate.
It's on New King James right now. So,
Give me
but
my,
let's
give me
let's
my
just
New
do it.
King James.
Oh man, you know what? It's okay. It's all right. It's here.
I would have done the King James too. It would have been fine.
So,
I always fall back on the King James anyway, so it's totally okay. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29. Notice what it says here. When the Lord your God cuts off from before the nations which you go to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their land, notice, take heed to yourselves that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, now notice, how did these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. Notice in this verse that God is especially concerned with the kind of worship they're giving, how they're doing that worship, right? Notice what it says in the next verse. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. For every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they have done in to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters to the fire. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. Whatever. I mean, anything I command you, this would include the Sabbath, right? The seventh day. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it nor take away. So when critics come and take away the seventh day and say it can be the first day or any day or no day, just like in this situation, they can say, well, we'll worship God the way they worship their God, in their manner or lack thereof. That is a problem in God's eyes and is an issue, it's a moral issue for him. And so we have, by way of this, the principle behind, I admit that this is not talking about the seventh day per se, but the principle behind these verses right here is that God is asking to be worshiped his way. His way. So he says the seventh day, it's the seventh day, right? That doesn't mean that we don't worship God every day. We can worship God every day. In fact, we should worship God every way. The Bible tells us there's actually a psalm. I don't know, were you guys aware, or those in the comment section? There's actually a psalm that is dedicated to the Sabbath. Anybody know what that psalm is? Psalm 92. Go there real quick, brother. Psalm 92, verse 1. Notice what it says in this particular word. Now, we're talking about David, who's himself a Sabbath keeper. This is David, right? But notice what he says. This is the only psalm dedicated to the Sabbath. It says, it is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing praises in your name, O Most High, to declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness, what does it say there? Every night. Notice how within the within the psalm about the Sabbath, which is once a week, Yet within there, he speaks about worshiping God every night, in the morning and every night. In other words, Sabbath keeping should not prevent you from worshiping daily. Sabbath keeping does not prevent you from being grateful to the Lord daily and expressing praise on a daily basis. Sabbath keeping, however, is a special day, just like you would have a special day with your on your anniversary with your wife. Go ahead and tell your wife that it doesn't matter what day is your anniversary and how she responds. Now imagine just for a moment how God would feel when he says that that's his particular day, right? I mean, imagine somebody telling you happy birthday on the wrong day, or celebrating, let's say, Independence Day in the United States on the wrong day. People look at you like you're crazy. No, the day has special significance. It's an issue for God. God says the seventh, that's the day. Does that make sense, everybody? Give me a one if that makes sense in the chat, or a yes if that makes sense. Let me know that you're following along. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint now, and let's go ahead and detail this just a little bit more. So far, these three elements about the Sabbath are moral issues. The first one, work. That's a moral issue. The second, rest. That's a moral issue. The third, doing it God's way. That's a moral issue as well. The fourth one, it pertains to moral principles. Now, this is very important. In order to successfully violate the fourth commandment, you have to violate two other commandments. What do I mean? Well, the Sabbath, does it belong to the Lord? Yes or no? Is it his day?
If he says it's the Sabbath of the Lord your God.
Yeah, it's his day. In order for you to take that day and not dedicate it to him and respect it, but do whatever you want with it, it's as if you're taking that to yourself and is a violation by principle of the command forbidding to steal. As a matter of fact, before you even take the day to yourself, you have to, in your mind, want that which does not belong to you. And that is the definition of coveting. And so you have to covet and you have to steal in order to successfully break the fourth commandment. And this is why the Bible tells us in James chapter 2 that when you break one, you break them all, because each of the commandments are intertwined and connected. The moment you break one, you have, in one way or another, whether I know how to explain it or not, you have successfully violated the rest of them because they're connected. Now, if you're doubting this, I'm going to give you a biblical example. The Bible speaks of the forbidden tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in the book of Genesis, chapter 3, right? There's nothing particularly, at least on the outset, you see that tree, likely a beautiful tree, likely the fruit looks delicious, but nothing about the tree tells you that there's something wrong with you going over there to eat it. Nothing inherently visibly wrong with it. At least we can perceive it that way. But why is it that it turned out to be wrong to do that? Because Eve was told not to do that. Adam was told not to do that. Just like God tells his people not to do what they want to do on the seventh day. You see the parallel? And so, therefore, in order for Eve to successfully break the command that was given to her at that time, Adam and Eve, to not eat of the forbidden tree, she had to do two things. She had to covet that which didn't belong to her, and then she had to steal that thing and then eat it and successfully break the commandment. All right, go to Genesis chapter 3. Let's look at it. So, Genesis chapter 3, and we're going to look at the parts where Eve had to take of that fruit, desire that fruit, and then eat it. Notice what it says in verse 6. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. When it says that she desired, the Hebrew word for desired is the same word used, translated covet, in the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. I understand, of course, that the word is used in various particular contexts, but nevertheless, what she's doing here is basically coveting because she's looking at something and desiring something that doesn't belong to her. So she covets. But then her coveting led to the second violation of another principle, which was to then steal, because then the text says she took of the fruit thereof. So she took something does not belong to her. She was specifically told not to do, not to take, and then she finally committed the official act of eating that which she was not supposed to eat. Does that make sense? And so she violated two principles here before the commandment was officially broken. She coveted took what she desired something that does not belong to her, and then she took it, which is also does not belong to her, and therefore violated two important principles: coveting and stealing, and successfully broke the commandment. So as we go back to our PowerPoint, we notice a parallel there between that and the Sabbath commandment. We see that if the Sabbath belongs to God, the Bible tells us in the book of Isaiah. Can you pull that text up, brother, in Isaiah where it says, "My Sabbath, if thou turn away thy foot from my Sabbath, from doing thine own pleasure on my holy day, call the Sabbath a delight, holy of the Lord." Notice what it says, verse 13. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, doing thine own pleasure on my holy day. So that belongs to him. And call the Sabbath a delight, holy of who? Of the Lord. So it belongs to him. It's his. So for you to take that and do whatever you want with it, you're basically taking what's his and breaking the commandment, doing your own thing. And yes, we see various parallels of that taking place. Somebody mentioned Cain bringing his own fruits. People typically in the scriptures, you find that typically what's happening is people are doing something taking something that belongs to God or desiring something that belongs to Him. For example, the serpent put it into the mind of Adam and Eve, you shall be like God. And so suddenly they thought, well, here's an idea, coveting or desiring something that doesn't belong to them. Satan did the same thing in Isaiah chapter 14. He says, I will ascend up to the heavens. I will sit upon the sides of the north. And then he says, I will be like the Most High. Again, desiring something that doesn't belong to you. That's officially breaking the principle of the 10th commandment. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Let's go to our final principle here if we hit back our PowerPoint. And so in our final principle, we see here that it continues to be a moral issue after the cross. The reason why this is here is because somebody may argue and say, well, these first 4 points are all good and dandy before the cross, but after the cross, we don't got to keep the Sabbath anymore, and therefore it's no longer a moral commandment, as if morality can change. But actually, the Bible tells us that the respect and the honoring of the Sabbath continued even after the cross. How do we know? For example, Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, there's still a day that belongs to God. In fact, it says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Lord's means belongs. It's the same Greek word used for the Lord's Supper, something that belongs to him. So there's a day that belongs to him. That day is not the second coming. It's not the day of judgment, because that's not what the context says. The very next thing that they see, that John sees at that moment, once he says, I was Spirit on the Lord's day, is Jesus speaking and walking through 7 branches, the heavenly 7 branches, right, in the heavenly sanctuary. He doesn't see the second coming. He doesn't see the day of judgment. It's not what he sees. It's a literal day he was on as much as the literal island he was on. He was on at the moment, Patmos, right? So he was on an official day. People argue that that's Sunday, the first day of the week. And the only way they can argue with that is by using the invention of some of the church fathers who applied that phrase to the first day of the week. But that's again an invention. The Bible always calls the Sabbath the Lord's day. We just read it in the book of Isaiah, where God says, calling it the Sabbath of the Lord. It belongs to Him. He is Lord of it. Jesus says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. And so we still have respect and honoring of the Sabbath. In fact, I'll show this verse, and then there's another one in the book of Luke that's not there, where they were still keeping the Sabbath even after Jesus was laid in the tomb. So they obviously didn't get the impression that it ended. In fact, it says they kept the Sabbath according to the commandment. So the commandment was still in force. Irrespective of them being Jewish women at that time, they never got the impression that the Sabbath came to an end, not at any moment during Jesus' ministry. Matthew 24:20 speaks about the Sabbath being kept at least 40 years after the cross. Contextually, in the book of Matthew 24, Jesus is mixing in what's going to happen 40 years later, along with what's going to happen during the last days. So this is a last days prophecy, but he takes the destruction of Jerusalem as an example of what's going to happen then. But if you go subtract a little bit as close as possible to the time of Christ, at least 40 years after the cross, just prior to the destruction of the temple, Jesus says, pray that your fight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now, I've heard critics say, Deontay knows a lot about this. I've heard critics say, well, that's talking about, the gates being closed on the Sabbath, and they'll quote a text in Nehemiah 13. The issue with that is that if you backtrack just a few verses, Jesus is not just talking about Jerusalem. He's not just talking about Jerusalem where there were gates. He's talking about those in Judea where there were no gates. So the issue is far beyond gates, although that may have been a concern. The issue was that they were still congregating together just like Leviticus 23 says to do, a holy congregation. They would still be congregating together and thus making their escape harder because there's more damage and destruction that can take place upon a group of people in one location than if they're all spread out. And so Jesus tells them, pray. Since this is going to be something that's still going to take place, pray that it doesn't take place at that time. All right, so as we go back to our presentation, we found that there are 5 reasons why the Sabbath is the fourth commandment by looking at each element of the fourth commandment. By looking at each element. Now let's ask ourselves the question. This is back to the definition of morality. Are any of these concerned with principles of right and wrong? Remember, we read earlier what the definition of moral is. It is something that is concerned with principles of right and wrong. Is work concerned with principles of right or wrong and rest? Yes or no? You can go ahead and share in the chat. Is work and rest concerned with principles of right and wrong? What about doing it God's way and not my way? Is that concerned with principles of right and wrong? What about not stealing, not coveting something that doesn't belong to you, or stealing? Is that concerned with principles of right and wrong? And so what we have here is every aspect of the fourth commandment has itself elements that all are connected to something moral. Does that make sense to everybody? Give me a 1 if it makes sense, and or tell me yes in the chat if you're following along. What we're seeing here is that each element of the fourth commandment is a moral issue.